What's up guys, this is Preheat, and today we're going to be discussing the most recent changes that have hit the PTR. Of course, that is going to be referring to the nerfs to Fire and to Arcane Mage. Now, I know a lot of you are probably a little disappointed, myself included, that Fire got such a huge nerf to the set bonus, the 4-piece specifically. But I do want to kind of just have a frank discussion about this because you know, let's be honest, guys, right? Like, the set bonus was a little bit overpowered. I think a lot of people assumed that it was going to fly under the radar because it has a downside, it damages you as well. That somehow made it fine for it to be, you know, way stronger than basically everyone else's 4 pieces. But, well, it turns out that's not the case, right? Now, based on that change, I am curious to know what they're going to do with the damage taken aspect of it. They've already nerfed it in half, down to only 1% per second, but it doesn't really make sense to have a tier bonus that has a downside when it's not even as good as the other ones for the other specs, right? Like, if you look at Arcane tier bonus, if you look at Frost tier bonus, these bonuses are actually stronger now than the Fire tier bonus. So I don't think it really makes sense for Fire Mage to have a downside on its tier bonus if it's kind of the worst of the bunch, right? Like, that just doesn't make sense. I mean, obviously, it's still very early. Obviously, there's more adjustments coming. I expect to see at least something else happen to mages at least. But, you know, mages overall look like they're in still a pretty good spot. I mean, even if raiding mages don't have the best case scenario where Fire is just the most overpowered spec. I mean, if you look at Mythic Plus, Frost is insane. Okay, so at least we still have a lot of modes for PvE that are still very, very strong. But we're just going to jump right into it. So let's start. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started by looking at Fire, since I know that that's probably the reason why a lot of y'all are here. A lot of y'all probably don't really care too much about the Arcane changes, but I want to give a quick shout out to all my Arcane brothers and sisters. Stay strong. We caught a stray bullet, but you know, we'll still be strong as ever, I'm sure. But I mean, obviously Fire is the spec that everyone was kind of looking forward to, myself included. I was very excited to play Fire in 9.2. I was very excited to be able to use the new set bonus to do a lot of damage. I mean, it's always really fun whenever Fire is the best spec because you've got so many tools. You've got cheat death as well. You know, Fire is just a really, really solid spec right now. Obviously, it was a bit overtuned. The 4-piece was a bit too strong, and they've brought it back down to earth. And you know, we're going to talk about how much that change actually means for us, and if it actually means that Fire may not be the, you know, the best spec anymore. So I do have a little notepad here that I started some information on. This is from my stream that I did whenever the news first broke, whenever I was streaming that night. And a lot of the numbers that we have here were estimates that I put in without looking at any sims, right? This was just like guesstimates based off of my own experience and what we've kind of seen so far. But a lot of them ended up being basically right on. So we're going to talk about these here. Basically, all these numbers are still correct. So we'll just go down the list. So to start things off, the things that we're looking at here on the Sims, right? And this is the Toegrinder Sims. He's provided these. This is on his website, toegrinder.github.io. The link will be down in the description if you want to look at these yourself. These have been updated for the nerfs. So this is actually the post-nerf Sims. Just make sure that you choose the right tab here. If you do not have a PTR tab selected, you're obviously looking at the wrong stuff. Anyways, so looking at the tier bonuses as a baseline, Night Fae and Vinthir are going to be pretty much in a dead heat tie here, both at 10,700-ish DPS. And if we look at the 2-piece bonus compared to that, we're going to be looking at probably a difference of less than 2%. The 2-piece is essentially worthless, okay? And they didn't change it. They did not change the 2-piece at all whenever they gutted the 4-piece. I was kind of hoping that they would maybe shift some of the power of the 4-piece because the 4-piece was just obviously overinflated, right? I was hoping that they would take some of the power from the 4-piece and maybe scooch it on over to the 2-piece. And that way it wouldn't feel so bad not having 4-piece. And then once you unlock it, you just get this huge power up, right? But unfortunately, that is not what they did. They did nothing to the 2-piece. It is still basically useless. 2% in the best case scenario, single target, and then in AoE it falls off a cliff. It's like 0.5% damage increase, right? Basically, doesn't really matter if you have it or not. So yeah, that's the 2-piece in a nutshell. Basically, it's useless. And the 4-piece actually nerfs the 2-piece whenever it got reduced, right? So obviously, more combustion uptime is what we're going for. 2 extra seconds isn't really that big of a deal. However, it was affected by the increased generation of Fire Blast, so it does take a little bit of a hit. So comparing the 2-piece to the 4-piece, it looks like we have a difference here of around 9%. It's actually a little bit lower. And if we compare the old numbers to new numbers, this is what we kind of end up with. So in the old 2-piece, old Night Fae Fire 2-piece, we had a 0.1 or 1.9% damage increase. For 4-piece, it was 18.96%. And this is Night Fae, by the way, and Vintir was actually a little bit higher. For a total of 20.86% damage increase from having your full 4-piece. And the amount of damage that that gave us in the end, right? Like if you were to mouse over it, it would be 12,795 damage. So if we subtract the current damage, which is 11,745, from that number, we end up with a difference of about 1,050 damage. This is about how much damage we're going to be losing, assuming that you have around the gear that this, that this mage has, essentially here. So it's really easy to figure out how much of a nerf this is. It's actually not a 10% nerf, okay? Even though the new numbers for fire, right? Like, so the new estimate is around 1.4% to 1.8% on the two-piece bonus, depending on if you're Vintir or Night Fae. Night Fae gains a little bit more. 4-piece for the fire set is now 8 to 9%. That's a guesstimate, but ended up being basically around the money for a total of 10% damage increase. Okay, so if you compare this 10% versus this 20%, you would assume that it's a 10% nerf, but that's actually the wrong way of doing it. You need to make sure that you do your math correctly here. What we're looking at is the difference between the two, and we need to divide it by the higher number to determine how much of a nerf this is, right? So if you're looking at where you were before the nerf, okay, versus now, it's actually a 8.2% nerf. It's still a big nerf. Don't get me wrong. It's still huge, right? Like 8% is a huge amount to be nerfed, but I just want to be clear that it wasn't 10%, right? Like maybe there's a situation where it could be, but I just want to make sure that everyone understands that it isn't quite as doom and gloom. Fire isn't dead by any means, okay? But it's definitely hurting. It's definitely not doing as well as it was. And then if we look at the 5 target for fire, the old fire, it looked like 2-piece was 0.5% damage increase, and the 4-piece was 57%. So yeah, it basically the end goal, or the end amount here is going to be around 17%. That was a typo. And the new amount that we get, we don't actually know this yet, but what we could do is just calculate real quick. So this was my estimate from last night. It looks like the actual amount is 0.5%. Yep, that's correct. And then the 4-piece is going to be 17.03. And we're going to be subtracting that from 23.83. So yeah, it ends up being around 6.8%. And I put 6 to 7%. So looky there, there we go. Why do I even do math? So yeah, as you can see, basically the amount of damage that we're gaining when it comes to AoE, it's obviously a lot less, right? Before, in 5 targets, we were getting 17% damage increase. And now we're way down to 7.5%. Is unfortunate, but what can you do? So yeah, as you can see, basically the amount of damage, or I guess the tier bonus itself is giving us around 10% less damage in AoE and in single target. So this is not a change that just affects single target. It's basically affecting fire all the way across the board. So yeah, that's the gist of it. There's not really much else to say about the fire changes. Obviously, I think a lot of people are a little bit disappointed. A lot of folks were really hoping that this tier bonus would stay as overpowered as it was. And, I respect wanting things to be overpowered because it's fun, but I mean, let's be honest, guys. Like this 4-piece was a little bit too strong. Okay, just between us, like it was a little bit too strong. It probably makes sense for it to be nerfed, but the amount it was nerfed by seems a little weird to me. And also, I don't like that it still has the negative side to this, right? Like if you're gonna nerf our tier bonus to make it the least powerful tier bonus for all of the specs for Mage, right? By the way, every spec of Mage has a better tier bonus than Fire. Now, why is there a downside still? Like, if we don't have a downside as Fire, or sorry, if we don't have a downside as Frost, if we don't have a downside as Arcane, if other classes don't have downsides on their tier, why does Fire have a downside? It's not overpowered at all. In fact, it's the worst of the Mage tier bonuses. So why is there a negative associated with it as well? It doesn't make any sense. And I get that they nerfed the downside down to 1%, but I'm sorry, it just shouldn't have a downside anymore. It doesn't make any sense. If you're going to have a set bonus be overpowered and you're going to give it a downside, then whenever you nerf it so that it's balanced with everything else, you have to get rid of the downsides, okay? It just doesn't make any sense to make Fire Mages have this insult to injury on top of everything else. Anyways, so moving on to Arcane. We're going to be starting off with single target, obviously. So in our old numbers here, what we calculated was Arcane was a damage increase of 9.5% roughly with the 2-piece, which was very, very strong, right? The 2-piece is what actually got changed. The 4-piece remains unchanged. However, the 2-piece is, of course, a factor in the 4-piece, right? Because the 4-piece gives us more uptime on Touch of the Magi, which means the damage increase is going to be up on the mob for longer. So those two things are linked. Kindling is linked with the Fire 4-piece as well. And that's a whole conversation that I didn't really delve too deep into, but essentially, you know, all of this stuff is interconnected. So if we look at the old amount that Arcane used to get from the 2-piece, looks like it was around 9.5%. And now we actually have some sims for the new amount that we're actually getting here. So it looks like in on the baseline here, we got 31.15%, and now we are at 35.57%, which ends up being around 4.42%. Looking at our guesstimate here, we wrote 5%, so that's pretty close. We're going to go ahead and update that. And then on the new 4-piece, we're going from 35.57 to 42.57. So that's going to be around 7.3%. And the guesstimate that I gave last night was 7%. So, hey, look, we're once again pretty close here. So we're going to go ahead and add these two together for a total of 11.72%, which is just about where our estimate was initially. Cool. So yeah, this is the new Arcane amount. It's going to be a damage increase of around 11.72% for the entire tier bonus versus the old bonus, which was 18%. I do not know why Arcane was nerfed. Honest to God, I don't understand it, okay? I understand that they're wanting to bring some of these tier bonuses down in line with the other ones, but Arcane didn't really stand out to me as like this overpowered spec and raid. I mean, I could see it maybe for like some Mythic Plus memes that people are cooking up with some Arcane Echo, but it doesn't make sense, right? Like if that was the case, like just nerf Arcane Echo then, right? Like don't blow up, you know, the Kyrian Arcane mages as well, especially for raiding mages, right? But yeah, so the reality of the situation is basically before Arcane was looking like the spec to play in the first week because you were only able to secure 2-piece at best. Now it looks like 2-piece is only going to give you about a 4.42% damage increase. Obviously, that's a bit more than Fire, but Frost is still way ahead, right? So if we look at Frost, which hasn't been touched, by the way, we have a 2-piece bonus that gives us around 8% damage increase. And the amount of damage we get from the 4-piece is around 4.62% for a total of about 12%. And here's that information here on your screen. Now, obviously, these numbers here that I used last night were just based off of whichever profile I picked. I don't remember which one it was exactly, so if I'm a little bit off on the math, you know, don't come after me too much. But yeah, the gist of it is the Frost 2-piece bonus is just as strong as the Arcane bonus was, and yet it remains unchanged. Whereas the Arcane one has been nerfed inexplicably. Now, do I want Frost to get nerfed? No, I don't think Frost deserves a nerf, at least not in Raid. In Mythic Plus, that's a little bit of a different situation, right? I think we can all agree, if you've been watching streams on the PTR, that Frost Mage in Mythic Plus looks quite good. But obviously, that's not what my focus is here today. I'm talking mainly about raiding as mages. And, you know, Frost didn't get nerfed, so we don't really have a conversation to be really having about how this affects Mythic Plus. But what I do think is that these changes overall imply that there is some sort of thought process behind balancing not the classes themselves, but tier bonuses. Obviously, this is a nerf specifically to the tier bonuses, right? But they do affect the legendaries in some ways. Obviously, there is a lot of synergy between Fire, Sun King Blessing, and the 4-piece, right? There was. And to me, that seems like the bigger outlier in all this, right? I mean, all the Fire Mages basically are going to be using Sun King's Blessing in this patch. That's all I really have to cover today, so thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.